It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I never thought my life would turn into some convoluted thriller, but here I am, sitting at the kitchen table in our home in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, holding a letter that has turned everything upside down. I'm 38, and for the past 12 years I've lived with Caitlin, my wife, in this cozy two-story house with blue shutters and a backyard where we hosted barbecues for the neighbors every summer. We didn't have kids, but we had a cat named Mr. Biscuit who liked to sleep on the windowsill, and a job that kept us afloat. I was a manager at a logistics company and she was a freelance interior designer. I thought we were doing okay, maybe not perfect, but stable. We quarreled sometimes, like all couples do, but I never suspected that there was something more behind it than the usual domestic disagreements. It all started a couple months ago when I noticed that Caitlin had become somewhat distant. She talked less at dinner, sat on her phone more often, staring at the screen, and left the house a couple times without explanation, simply saying she needed to get some air. I put it down to stress. She had a big project with some rich client, and she often complained that he was driving her crazy. I tried to support her, cooked dinner when she came home late, and even offered to take a vacation so we could go somewhere together, like in the old days. She smiled and nodded, but something in her gaze was wrong. It was like she was looking through me. Then I started finding odd little things. One day, a receipt from a downtown cafe was left in her car, even though she said she'd been at home all day drawing. Another time I found a shirt in the wash that smelled like men's cologne, not mine. I asked her about it, trying not to sound accusatory, and she brushed it off, saying it was probably from a client she was seeing for work. I believed it because I wanted to believe it. We'd been together too long for me to begin to suspect the worst, but the splinter of doubt had already lodged itself in my head, and it only gnawed deeper every day. Yesterday, it all came crashing down. I got home early from work. We had a cancelled meeting, and I decided to surprise her by buying her favorite wine and dinner ingredients on the way. The house was quiet when I walked in. Only Mr. Biscuit met me at the door, rubbing against my legs. Caitlin was gone. There was a note on the table saying she'd gone to a friend's house for a couple hours. I ignored it, put the wine in the fridge, and went upstairs to change. And then I noticed an envelope on her desk in her office, which she always kept closed. My name was written in her handwriting, neat and slightly slanted to the right. I froze, staring at it, and felt my heart race. Something told me it wasn't just a note reminding me to buy milk. I sat down at the table, opened the envelope, and began to read. The letter was long, several pages long, and from the first lines I knew it wasn't just an explanation, it was a bombshell. She confessed that she'd been having an affair with another man for the past 6 months. His name was Ethan, and he was her client, the same rich jerk she'd been nagging so much about. I felt the blood rush from my face, but I kept reading because I couldn't stop. She wrote that she hadn't planned it, that it had started by accident, with one dinner after work, and then she couldn't stop. My throat constricted and I almost crumpled the paper in my hands, but what happened next was what made me freeze. She wasn't just apologizing, she was trying to justify herself. She wrote that she felt lost in our marriage, that I had become too predictable, too comfortable, and that she missed the fire we had in the beginning. But then she moved on to something I didn't expect. She told me that 5 years ago she had a miscarriage that I knew nothing about. We were trying to have a baby at the time, but after months of failure, we decided to take a break. I thought she was just tired of it, but it turns out she was pregnant and lost the baby while I was away on a business trip. She didn't tell me because she didn't want to see my pain or my pity, and ever since she wrote, something in her broke. I sat staring at those words, trying to realize what I had just read. A miscarriage. 5 years ago. She'd been carrying it around all this time while I'd been living my normal life, unaware that she was going through such hell alone. She wrote that Ethan made her feel alive again, that he knew her pain and helped her cope, which she said I didn't. I felt rage and guilt mix inside me. I was angry at her for cheating, for lying, for choosing some stranger over me, but at the same time I asked myself if I had noticed anything, if I could have helped her then, 5 years ago, if I had known. The letter ended with her leaving for him. She won't be back today. Not at all. She left me the house, Mr. Biscuit, and a request not to look for her. I laid the letter on the table, and my mind was empty. I didn't know whether to feel betrayal or pity. It was too much to put into my head in one evening. It had been a day since I'd found that letter, and I still felt like I'd been run over by a truck. I sat in the living room of our house in suburban Atlanta, staring at the empty couch where Caitlin and I usually watched soap operas in the evenings. Mr. Biscuit curled up in a ball on the cushion next to me, and his quiet purr was the only sound in this humming, too big for one-person house. I stayed up all night after reading her words. They'd been playing in my head like a broken record about Ethan, about the miscarriage, about how I'd been oblivious to the fact that my wife was slowly falling apart. I tried to think back to those months 5 years ago when we were trying for a baby. Were there any signs? Maybe she was quiet more often or looked tired, but all I remembered was her saying one day that she wanted to take a break, and I agreed, thinking it was just fatigue. How could I have been so blind? In the morning I forced myself to get up and go to work, not because I wanted to, but because it was unbearable to stay at home. I drove down familiar streets, past the coffee shop where she and I often took our lattes on weekends, past the park where we'd walked in the early years of our marriage. All of this now seemed like scenery to someone else's life. At work, I sat at my desk, pretending to check invoices, but really just staring at the screen, scrolling through her email in my head. My coworkers noticed I was out of it. One even asked if I was okay, but I brushed it off by muttering something about not sleeping well. I didn't want to tell anyone. It was too personal, too raw. When I got home, I decided to reread the letter again. Maybe I'd missed something, maybe there was something in there that would explain it better. I pulled it out of the drawer where I had shoved it the day before and sat down at the kitchen table. Reading about the miscarriage again, I felt something inside clench. She'd written that she hadn't told me because she was afraid of my reaction, afraid I'd start blaming myself or caring about her too much. She wanted to cope on her own, but she didn't. And then, years later, this Ethan came along and became some kind of lifeline for her. I tried to imagine her holding it in, shopping with me, laughing at my stupid jokes, and having this secret, this pain inside her. I was angry at her for not confiding in me, but at the same time, I was beginning to understand why she'd shut down. Then I got to the part about Ethan, and the anger returned with renewed vigor. She described how he listened to her, how they talked for hours about things she said I'd never asked. She wrote that he helped her feel like a woman again, not just a shadow in our marriage. I almost tore the paper up because it was like a blow under my breath. I was working, paying the bills, fixing the faucet when it leaked, and she, it turns out, missed some deep conversations I wasn't giving her. But then I wondered, had I even asked her how she was feeling? Not about work or the weather, but about herself? I always thought that if she wanted to talk, she would. Maybe I was wrong. I put the letter aside and went to the garage, where I had an old box of our photos. I started flipping through them. Here we were on the beach in Savannah, here we were at her brother's wedding, here we were just at home, with Mr. Biscuit on our laps. She was smiling in all those pictures, and I was, too. But now I looked at those smiles and asked myself when they became fake. Maybe after the miscarriage? Or before? I didn't know. I sat there, among the dusty boxes, and for the first time in a long time, I cried. Not from anger, but from some strange cocktail of grief and guilt. I mourned not only for our marriage, but for Caitlin, who had suffered in silence while I lived my normal life. It had been a few days since I'd found Caitlin's letter, and I was still living in a fog. Our house in the suburbs of Atlanta seemed foreign to me now. Every corner, every detail reminded me of her, but at the same time, it was like a set for a play that was long over. I went to work, fed Mr. Biscuit, even tried to watch TV, but it was all on automatic. My real attention was on that letter, which I'd reread 10 times already, trying to make some sense of it. I was angry at her, feeling sorry for her, blaming myself and so on and so forth until my head started to buzz. But I knew I couldn't just sit there and drown in this swamp. I had to do something. I decided to pack up her things. Not throw it away, not burn it in a fit of anger, but just put it in boxes and out of sight. Maybe it was a way to start letting go, or maybe it was just an attempt to regain control of my own life. I started with her bedroom closet, pulling out dresses, blouses, the very shoes she wore on our rare dates. I folded everything neatly, though my hands were shaking with emotions I couldn't name. And then, under a stack of her sweaters, I came across something strange, a small wooden box I'd never seen before. It was old, with frayed edges, and smelled something like sandalwood. I opened it, and inside was a single object, a faded photograph. The picture was of Caitlin, younger than I knew her, in her early 20s. She was standing next to some guy, tall, with dark hair and a smile that seemed all too familiar. They were out in nature somewhere, with trees and a lake around, and she looked happy, really happy, not like in our later photos. On the back was handwritten, "Summer 2008, forever." I froze, holding that photo, because something about it kept bugging me. I didn't know this guy, she'd never mentioned anyone from her past who might be so important. But that date, 2008, the year before we met, and the word "forever" hinted at the secret she carried with her. Who is it? And why had she kept it all these years? I put the picture back in the box and stashed it in my desk drawer. I don't know why I didn't throw it away, maybe because it was further proof of how little I knew the woman I'd lived with for over a decade. This picture added another layer to my confusion. The miscarriage, Ethan, and now this mysterious guy from the past. I felt like I was solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I didn't dig deeper, didn't look for answers in her old stuff or social media. Something told me that this secret would stay with her, and maybe it should. That evening I sat down to write again. I tried to figure out if her pain justified what she'd done. The miscarriage explained her detachment, her silence, but cheating with Ethan was a choice, not an accident. I was angry she hadn't talked to me, hadn't given me a chance to be there for her, but at the same time I wondered if I'd given her a reason to trust me that much. And that picture from the jewelry box only added fuel to the fire. Maybe she'd spent our whole life together comparing me to someone I'd never known? I couldn't answer that, and frankly, I didn't want to. Some secrets are better left unsolved. It had been a week since I found that picture box, and I finally realized it was time to end this story. I was living in our house in suburban Atlanta, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, and every day I felt them pressing down on me harder and harder. Mr. Biscuit still slept on the windowsill, but even his presence couldn't fill the emptiness that grew inside. I was tired of asking myself unanswered questions, tired of rereading Caitlin's letter and wondering if her pain justified what she'd done. I needed to set the record straight, and I knew I'd have to dig deeper to do it, even if I was afraid of what I'd find. I decided to deal with that picture. It kept bugging me, that guy with the smile, summer 2008, forever. I pulled the box out of the drawer and looked at the picture again. Something about the man's face seemed familiar, but I couldn't grasp where I might have seen him. Then I remembered that Caitlin had an old laptop she'd left in her office. She had rarely used it in recent years, but I knew there might have been some clues in there. I turned it on, typed in the password, the date of our wedding. She'd never changed it, and started going through the folders. It was full of work files, sketches of interiors, but then I came across a folder called Archives, hidden among old documents. Inside, I found hundreds of photos. Some were from our trips together, but most were from her life before me. And among them, I saw him, the guy from the lake. His name was Nate, according to the captions. They were together on beaches, in the mountains, at parties. She looked so alive in these photos, like I hadn't seen her in a long time. I leafed further and found a video dated August 2008. I turned it on and there was Caitlin, laughing while Nate filmed her on the shore of that very lake. She was yelling something about the water and he was teasing her about being afraid to swim. Then he turned the camera on himself, and I froze. His face, his voice, I finally realized why he seemed familiar. It was Ethan. Not just any customer, but the same Nate from her past, only older, with a different haircut and a couple new wrinkles. My heart raced like I'd just run a marathon. I went back to Caitlin's letter and reread the part about Ethan. She'd written that he was her client, that it had started by accident, but now I saw the truth. It wasn't an accident. He'd been a part of her life long before me, and from the looks of it, she'd never forgotten him. I began to put the pieces together. The miscarriage she hadn't told me about might not have been her first grief. Maybe Nate, or Ethan, as he now called himself, had left her after some other loss, and she tried to build a new life with me, but she'd never been able to let go of the past. And then he came back, rich, successful, and everything she'd been repressing came out. I found his profile online through her freelance platform's website. He was a designer who had commissioned a design from her for his new home in Atlanta. I even found his address, a swanky mansion in Buckhead, a half-hour drive from here. I didn't go there, didn't call or write. I didn't need to see him to realize what had happened. Caitlin hadn't just cheated on me with some random man, she'd gone back to the man she'd loved before me, the one who'd probably been her forever. The miscarriage had broken her, but I was only a temporary patch, not a true salvation. She didn't tell me about him because she didn't want to destroy the illusion of our marriage until she was sure he would take her back. I put her things in boxes, left the laptop and jewelry box on top, and called a courier to send everything to Ethan's address. I didn't write a note, didn't leave an explanation. Caitlin's letter said it all for both of us. Then I packed my things, took Mr. Biscuit, and left. I rented a small apartment downtown, away from the suburbs, away from the memories. I put the house up for sale through an agent. I didn't need that piece of the past anymore. As I settled into my new place, I felt strangely relieved. She had betrayed me, but now I knew why. Her pain didn't justify the betrayal, but it explained it. And me? It wasn't my fault I couldn't be the one she'd loved all her life. Now I sit in my new apartment, watching Mr. Biscuit make do with the windowsill, and I realize it's over. I'm not angry anymore. She's with him and I'm free. Secrets are out, and I can move on with my life knowing the truth even if it's bitter. It's been 2 years since I left behind our house in the suburbs of Atlanta and everything that connected me to Caitlin. I now lived in a small apartment downtown, in a neighborhood where the streets were always bustling and the windows overlooked a lively square with coffee shops and street musicians. This place was my new beginning, and I'm surprised at how quickly it started to feel like home. Mr. Biscuit is still with me. He's gotten older, a little lazier, but he still likes to snooze on the windowsill watching the pigeons. I've changed, too. I'm 40, and I'm no longer the confused man who 2 years ago sat with a letter to Caitlin in his hands, not knowing how to go on. Life has moved on, and I haven't even noticed how I've started to rebuild it. After the move, I threw myself into my work. My company offered me a promotion to regional manager, which meant more traveling around the state, more responsibility, but also more money. I accepted because I wanted to keep my head busy with something other than memories. Traveling helped. I saw new cities, met people, and gradually the heaviness that had been sitting in my chest began to dissolve. I even made a habit of stopping at little roadside diners, trying the local pie and listening to the waitresses' stories. It wasn't like my old life with Caitlin, where everything revolved around home and routine, and I loved it. I didn't think much about Caitlin, but sometimes I heard rumors through mutual acquaintances. The house sold quickly, and the money was split in half, as agreed through the lawyers. I'd heard she'd stayed with Ethan or Nate, as he'd been called in the past. They apparently got married a year after I left. Someone said they'd seen them at some social event in Buckhead, that she looked happy, but I didn't ask for details. I didn't care. I felt no anger or pity for her. She had just become a part of a story that was no longer mine. Her letter and that picture from the box remained somewhere in the past, like an old movie I'd rewatched too many times. About a year after I moved out, I started dating a woman named Sarah. We met by accident. I spilled coffee on her bag at one of those coffee shops under my apartment windows, and she laughed instead of getting angry. She's 35, works in a gallery, loves dogs, and can't stand sweets. It was weird getting used to someone new after so many years with Caitlin, but with Sarah it was easy. We took our time, just spending time together, going to exhibitions, walking in parks. She knew about my previous marriage. I told her in general terms, without too many details about the miscarriage or Ethan. She didn't need to know everything, and I didn't want to carry that weight into my new life. I recently received a letter, a real paper letter, postmarked. It was from Caitlin. I recognized her handwriting immediately, and for a second it felt like time had turned back. I didn't want to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a short message. She wrote that she and Ethan had a baby, a girl, and that she just wanted me to know. She didn't apologize, didn't explain anything, just reported the fact and signed her name. I stared at those lines and waited to feel something, hurt, jealousy, regret, but there was nothing. I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer, the same place where I kept old bills. Her life went its way, and mine went its way. Today I sit on the balcony of my apartment, drinking a beer and watching the sun set over the horizon. Sarah has gone to her parents for the weekend, and I'm left with Mr. Biscuit. 2 years ago I thought I'd lost everything, but now I see I've just made room for something new. Caitlin and her secrets, Ethan and their baby are no longer my story. I don't know what would have happened if she had told me about the miscarriage earlier, if I would have noticed her pain, but it doesn't matter anymore. I'm living in the here and now, and damn it, I like it. I may not be the guy she needed, but I'm definitely the guy I need for myself, and that's enough.